Sirens cut through the humid night air as rain slammed against the pavement, reflecting blue and red lights across a silent crowd that had gathered without shouting, without cheering, just watching. As a foreign tourist knelt on the ground with his hands cuffed behind him, his earlier laughter erased completely. His phone lying face down a few feet away, still recording a story that had spun wildly out of his control, because only hours earlier he had been mocking the very rules now being read aloud to him, rules he had laughed at, joked about, and openly challenged, convinced they meant nothing in a place he believed was too relaxed to enforce them. And yet here he was, soaked, shaken, and realizing far too late that Filipino discipline does not announce itself with chaos. It arrives quietly, patiently, and without mercy once you cross the line enough times. Days earlier, he and his friends had arrived brimming with confidence, the kind that comes from traveling often and never being corrected hard enough to learn, assuming the Philippines would be another easy backdrop for content, drinks, and stories they could exaggerate later, believing friendliness meant flexibility and politeness meant weakness, and from the moment they stepped off the plane, that assumption guided everything they did, cutting lines, ignoring instructions, filming security staff like props in their personal documentary, laughing when corrected, smirking when warned, completely unaware that every interaction was being noted. Because Filipino discipline doesn't rely on intimidation, it relies on systems, documentation, and consistency. And the tourists mistook silence for permission. The first real sign was small and almost laughable to them, a clear no smoking sign in a public area, which the tourist deliberately ignored, lighting up while recording himself, joking about how rules were just suggestions. And when a security officer approached calmly, explaining the regulation without raising his voice, the tourist exaggerated an apology, laughed it off, and continued filming. Convinced he had won some invisible battle, not knowing the officer had already logged the violation and stepped away, because confrontation wasn't necessary when process had already begun. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself, jaywalking across monitored intersections, ignoring pedestrian signals, pushing past people in queues, each time receiving polite corrections, each time responding with mockery or sarcasm, each time adding another quiet mark to a growing record, while locals began to recognize them, not with anger, but with withdrawal. Smiles fading, conversations stopping, hospitality cooling, because respect in the Philippines is reciprocal, and once lost, it rarely returns. The tourists noticed the change, but misread it again, calling people sensitive, strict, overly serious, never once asking themselves whether they were the problem, and that arrogance followed them into a crowded public festival where clear rules were announced repeatedly over loudspeakers, no climbing barriers, no entering restricted zones, rules designed for safety. Not control, but to the tourists. The barriers looked like a challenge, and one of them climbed over while filming, shouting jokes, turning himself into the center of attention, only for the crowd to fall unnervingly silent as security moved in swiftly and calmly, escorting him away, issuing a formal fine and a written warning that he signed without reading, still laughing, still convinced nothing real would happen, unaware that this document would later anchor everything that followed. As night fell and alcohol erased what little caution remained, the group refused to leave a regulated district after closing hours, arguing with staff, mocking accents, questioning authority, filming again as if documentation could protect them. But what arrived instead was coordinated enforcement. Police officers calm, professional, and prepared. IDs checked, records pulled, violations stacked neatly one after another, the smoking fine, the festival warning, the repeated public disturbances, transforming what the tourist thought were isolated jokes into a documented pattern of disrespect. And when humor failed, anger followed, then denial. But discipline does not negotiate with ego, and when the handcuffs clicked shut, the laughter disappeared instantly. Detention was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no threats, just forms, timestamps, and quiet explanations. Each violation read aloud, each regulation referenced clearly. The silence itself becoming the punishment, because attention was what he had chased, and attention was exactly what he no longer had. And for the first time, the tourist understood that this was never about one bad night. It was about repeated choices, about mistaking kindness for weakness and politeness for permission, about underestimating a culture where discipline is woven into daily life, not enforced through fear, but through expectation. Outside, locals reacted without emotion, no outrage, no celebration, just calm acknowledgement, because when discipline is internalized by a society, consequences don't feel dramatic. They feel inevitable. And by morning, the story had spread quietly, not as gossip, but as a lesson. He didn't listen, someone said, and that was enough. The tourist was released later with fines, restrictions, and a formal record that would follow him beyond the trip. No viral redemption arc, no triumphant ending, just the weight of understanding that rules exist not to limit freedom, but to protect mutual respect, and that when you mock discipline, you don't just break laws, you fracture trust. Much later, speaking with a subdued voice, he admitted he had misunderstood the country entirely, believing calm enforcement meant no enforcement at all, realizing too late that the Philippines doesn't need to shout to be firm. And that lesson stayed with him longer than any souvenir ever could. If this is your first time watching and you enjoy deep, real stories like this, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one.